Thank you, Jakub. Thank you all for coming today. I'm honored to be speaking to this wonderful group of innovative and exciting and excited journalists. So let me tell you something good. I'm going to start with a story from Cleveland, Ohio. A lot of American cities have a problem of lead paint. Houses that are fairly old in the United States were painted with paint that includes lead, and that paint chips, and children eat the paint chips or put them in their mouth, and then they suffer brain damage. And this is a big problem in many cities, and it's one that's very difficult and expensive to take care of. So the Cleveland Plain Dealer, the main newspaper in Cleveland, had done in the last 12 or 13 years 2 major series on the issue of lead, both of them exposing the problem. And in both cases, the results, the impact of the series was almost zero. A lot of people talking about, politicians talking about the problem, but no real effects. So we at the Solutions Journalism Network helped them to do a different kind of series. It did some classic investigative work looking at the problem of lead through the lens of race, but it also took a solutions approach. Right. So the idea was to take a problem that could have been dismissed as unavoidable and make it seem unacceptable by taking away the excuses of people in Cleveland who were not doing something about it. So here was the editor's note introducing this. Other cities are tackling this problem with cost-effective prevention strategies. We'll tell you exactly how these programs work and what they might cost, and we'll examine what is keeping Cleveland from adopting these smart solutions as a way to protect our children. So one of the stories they did was in Rochester, which was not that far away across the lake, and Rochester was doing a better job overall on the problem of lead. So the reporters went to Rochester and looked at what the city had done and what results it got. A lot of other cities around the Midwest were doing some small part of the lead problem better. For example, they talked to people in Akron, in Grand Rapids, in Dayton. I think most of this reporting was over the phone, but for example, one of those cities was testing children in school for lead. Another city had effectively created a registry of houses. So they looked at what those cities did, and they actually published a chart in the paper saying, here's what successful cities do, and here's what Cleveland does. So, as you can imagine, this is profoundly embarrassing to local officials. This time their series had impact. There was a lot of turnover. The health department director, 3 of the 4 commissioners were fired or resigned. They more than doubled the lead inspection staff. The city started adopting many of the best practices that other cities had been using. And this is an ongoing project for the Plain Dealer. They are continuing to report on it, but it's an example of what you can do for impact when you take away the excuses of people who are behaving badly by showing them that your neighbor is doing better with the same or fewer resources. So this is an example of solutions journalism. I want to briefly talk about how my own journey towards solutions journalism. I've lived it for many years in Latin America, and both in the United States and in Latin America, my reports tended to be about serious issues, human rights, public health, crises in education, stories that were often dismissed by my editors as too depressing. So back in the year 2000, I was working for the Sunday magazine of the New York Times, and I had another too depressing story. This one I thought was a really good investigative piece on the issue of the price of AIDS medicines in poor countries. And the fact that in countries where the burden of HIV was the highest, these medicines were priced completely out of reach. So what was a chronic and manageable disease in wealthy countries was still a death sentence in poor countries. That was widely known at the time. But what was not widely known was why. And the reason was collusion between the pharmaceutical industry and the Clinton administration, actually every administration in the US, this problem hasn't really changed, to put political pressure on countries not to make or buy generic drugs. So I pitched this to my editor, thinking this is a really important investigative story. He said, no, too depressing. We cannot inflict another long piece on all our readers about how everyone with AIDS is going to die in Malawi. So I went home and thought about it, and there was a way, I think, to turn the story inside out. There was one country that was making generic drugs and providing them to other people for free and defying the pressure from Washington, and that was Brazil. So the piece became, what is Brazil doing to save its people? What they have to fend off, to fight off in order to do that, and along the way of telling the story, I could say everything I wanted to say about bad behavior. So this was a much better way of telling the story. The first thing it accomplished was it got published. I didn't write the headline, by the way. I think that's overclaiming a bit. It also was fresh for readers. They did know that people with AIDS were dying in Malawi. They did not know that those people were living in Brazil. And it helped a little to push the debate from can poor countries use antiretroviral therapy to how can poor countries do what Brazil is doing. For readers, this was a story about AIDS in the year 2001 that felt empowering and exciting, which was an unusual thing. So that made me think, from then on, whenever I do a story that's too depressing, I think to myself, is there a possible solutions angle here to tell this story? So in the year 2010, David Bornstein, my work husband, I guess, and I started this column called Fixes, which is running every week in the New York Times, and every week we look at a different response to a social problem. We decided that we wanted to not keep this idea of writing about solutions to ourselves, so we started in 2013 the Solutions Journalism Network, and we work with news organizations to help them do these kinds of stories. We didn't invent solutions journalism. Lots of people do it and did it without putting a label on it. But we are trying to create a system for teaching it and spreading it and sort of a way of thinking about it that will allow it to spread more easily. So what is solutions journalism? This is an example, our first big project. Seattle has a terrible system of public education. They were tired of writing that same story over and over again. So they started a section called Education Lab that every month was a package of stories about something that was working in public education. By the way, I'll provide this deck to anybody who wants it, so you can have that there. Another example. We are increasingly now working with very small news organizations in parts of the country where journalism is scarce. We have collaboratives in New Mexico and Colorado and Montana. We have a big collaborative in the city of Philadelphia, where journalism isn't scarce actually, but so we're trying to work with more and more really tiny newsrooms, because a lot of places might say this is fine for the New York Times or the Seattle Times, but I have 5 people, I have 5 reporters, how can I do this? And the answer is, you can do this. And so we work with them to show them how and to create models that others might adopt. Another example, BBC World Hacks. BBC has their own solutions-focused journalism toolkit. They're very into this, and they have 2 programs that are specifically solutions-focused. This is one of them. Ordinary local broadcast TV, a 1-minute and 30-second story about a housing project in Queens, very violent in the past. They marked, as you can see, celebrated a year with no shootings. Another example, this is a story that looks at data, looked at the improvement a hospital made in its rates of hospital-acquired infections. This hospital was pretty much near the bottom, and when they wrote the story, it was pretty much in the middle. It was not a superstar hospital, but the way it improved was interesting and newsworthy, and so KPCC Los Angeles covered this. So this is the Tell Me Something Good that Jakub was referring to. We've just started a project with Google where if you have Google Assistant on your home device or on your phone, only in the US right now, unfortunately, but perhaps other countries later, you can say, hey Google, tell me something good, and Google will play you a solutions journalism story. SJN, we provide the stories, they're from our partners, and then you can click on the link to get the actual, go to the actual story and read it. So our partners are happy with that. The potential for new readership is large. So solutions journalism, we often talk about what it is by talking about what it is not. So here are some imposters, things that people think are solutions journalism that we don't consider part of SOJO. And one is silver bullet stories. These are stories that go well beyond what the evidence says and overclaim. like the headline on my Brazil story. This is a story about a soccer ball that doesn't deflate. And the first line, which I think was, unfortunately, you can't read here, was something like, it's a lifesaver. This ball is a lifesaver. Well, no, actually, probably not a lifesaver. But it is a soccer ball that doesn't deflate, so you can talk about that. Hero worship stories. These are stories that celebrate people for their good qualities, their good intentions. They're not solutions journalism because they don't look at impact. They don't look at the evidence of what has this person accomplished and how they accomplished it. Favor for a friend. Stories that might have been written by the NGOs they cover, like this one about Tom's Shoes. First line, the idea was genius, really. That is not solutions journalism. Real Sojo covers what is working and what is not working. It is as rigorous as coverage of the problem. Think tank stories. This is an important distinction. A think tank story is one where the reporter says, here's how I think a problem should be solved. It is predicting the future, it is talking about the future, it is theoretical, it is advocacy. Real solutions journalism is not that. It is reporting on what people are doing to try and respond to a problem and what results they're getting. On the ground reporting, just reporting the news. Afterthought. These are stories that are 95% about the problem, and then you realize you're leaving people on a big downer. So you're going to mention that there's some efforts to try and solve it, but no depth, no attempt to really look at what those efforts are. And finally, oh no, not finally, instant activist, also not Sojo. These are stories that tell the reader how they can become part of the solution. Or worse, actually, maybe not worse, but they show how the journalist is becoming part of the solution. That is not what we're talking about. We're talking about really classic reporting. Finally, Crispy Bacon, the disabled pig whose owner made a little wheelchair for him. I don't even know why people think this is solutions journalism. Real solutions journalism is insightful. It offers important information that society needs. It may or may not be inspirational as well. But this is not that. So here's what solutions journalism is. It uses characters to talk about work. The work is the hero of the story. It provides evidence of results. It's interested in effectiveness and not just good intentions. It seeks to provide insights and not just inspiration. And it doesn't read like a puff piece. It discusses limitations and puts the story in context. And one of the things we spend most of our time on at Solutions Journalism Network is showing journalists specifically how to do that. How do you write your story so you don't risk falling into looking like you're a cheerleader or an advocate? So why do solutions journalism? Why should you consider integrating it into your work? First of all, it can make your reporting more impactful. I think we've told that story with the Cleveland example and the Brazil story. Journalism's theory of change. We expose. Someone will then swoop in and solve the problem. How many of us are happy with how well that's working? Sometimes it happens, but very often it doesn't. And that's because we often need models. We often need to know that better is possible in society. Second, it's just better journalism. Remember Ebola? How many of you have heard of the Ebola crisis in 2014? Everybody? How many of you knew that there were countries in the region who had single or double-digit outbreaks and then controlled them, and how they did that? Few people? How many of you know that there's a vaccine that's 100% effective? Few people? This is important information. As many people should know about this as knew about that. That's just, we're not telling the whole story if we don't do this part. Third, increase audience engagement and trust. The American Press Institute, which is a very respected independent organization in the United States, did a study of the Seattle Times Education Lab, and they compared those stories to comparable traditional focused news stories on education. And they found that the solutions-focused stories had double the page views, almost double the time on page, more than triple the social shares, and a very high rate of returning to the same, going back to read more stories in the paper. This is research we've seen over and over and over again. The Guardian has a new vertical called The Upside, which is solutions journalism. They run cool stories like this. 1 in 10 readers of The Upside shares a story on social media. That's That's high. This was a video that ran in the Fixes column. I wish I had done it, but I have no talent in videography, so I didn't. Someone else did. But it was the single most shared story on the entire website of the New York Times last year. The Reuters Institute does every year a report on the state of digital news, and one of the things they consistently find, as have others, is that people tune out of the news because it's too negative. That is by far the major reason why people avoid news. AP in 2008 found the same thing. People tune out. They get news fatigue. They want to go back to bed and put the covers over their heads. But if they feel that there is something that is possible to do to try and solve a problem, however small, they tune back in. There's other research that shows that while negative stories go viral faster, solution stories and positive focus stories reach a larger audience. The BBC World Service did a study of its under 35 digital audience, and they found that solutions journalism was their top content request. The New York Times did a study of its mobile users who are not young, but are younger than people who read the New York Times in other ways. And their top content request, well, actually it was more weather, but solutions journalism was second. University of Texas did a study comparing, they asked people to read two versions of a story, and you can see the difference. The one with the solution in it, I think the interesting one is second. I would read more articles from the same newspaper. There has become recently, I mean, obviously we started this project when journalism in America anyway was suffering a single crisis, which was the economic crisis. Now we have an existential crisis to put on top of that one. And in many ways, it has made newsrooms more receptive to trying solutions journalism because it is a trust builder. And there's a lot of talk everywhere now about how to solve the problem of distrust in the media. And one way of solving that isn't much talked about is a problem of story selection. One of the newsrooms I work with is the Montgomery, Alabama Advertiser, which is a small news. It used to be 40 people, now it's 7 people, in the southern state of Alabama. And the first time I went, I asked them, what do you guys think of mainstream media coverage of Alabama? And they all said, terrible, we hate it. Why? Well, because you always make us look like ignorant yahoos. You always come here and you look for the people with 4 teeth. And I said, all right, let's, tell me how we can make that more accurate. And they said, it's actually not inaccurate. We do things that make us look like ignorant yahoos. But we also do things that don't, and you're never interested in that. You only cover the stuff that fits your stereotype of us. If you go to Anne Marie's city, go to Chicago, former city, and go to an inner city neighborhood, they are sick and tired of journalists coming in to write about how terrible it is to be a victim of gun violence. They know that's part of their reality. Those stories are true. They're not inaccurate, but they're not the whole story. People don't feel reflected or respected by the news media. And that is one reason, and I think a very big and undercovered reason why people don't trust us very much. We need to get out from the stereotypes and cover what people are doing, both the problems that they're suffering, but also how they're trying to respond to their problems, their lives in 3 dimensions. So revenue, and then I'll close. We have many partners who are using solutions journalism as a way to raise revenue they would not ordinarily be able to use. This is a tiny online newspaper in rural Ohio, and they do a lot of solutions journalism, and they asked businesses to chip into a fund that they could use for more solutions projects. In 1 month, they raised $67,000, which is pretty good for Mansfield, Ohio. They credit their sponsors. It's just like advertising. We have another partner in New Hampshire, the New Hampshire Union Leader, which had an 8-person newsroom. Now they have an 11-person newsroom. And they raised the money for those 3 new positions from local foundations. They did that by saying, we want someone to cover opioids, we want someone to cover aging, and we want someone to cover economic development. And all those beats are going to have a strong solutions component. And that solutions component was what persuaded the local foundations to give money to these beats. Seattle Times sells sponsorship for EdLab, and then they created a newsletter around EdLab and sold sponsorship for that. So in closing, the Solutions Journalism Network is a tool that anybody can access and use. One of the great things on our website, I think my favorite thing about it, is our story tracker. We collect solution stories, some by our partners, some by anybody. We just stumble on it. We put it into a database. It's highly searchable, so you can take a look at it and see what's out there, what people have written, look at different models for stories and different subjects that have been covered. It's a great way to get new ideas. We also have a learning lab with different toolkits and guides, and I'm very proud to announce Polish and Czech versions of our learning lab, in addition to, I think, 10 other languages. So I'm excited about that. So please reach out if we can be of any help to you. We are trying to do more and more work in this region. And thank you for letting me tell you about something good.